In 1453, Constantinople fell to Mehmed II and the Byzantine Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, the longest surviving state in history, was gone. Every textbook tells you that. What most textbooks don't tell you is that this was not actually the end of the Byzantine world. There were still Greek kingdoms. There were still emperors calling themselves heirs of Rome. The Byzantine world did not die in 1453. It flickered out over 2.5 centuries, one small kingdom at a time, from the Crimean mountains to the coast of the Black Sea, until the last tiny Greek principality fell in 1475, 22 years after Constantinople. To understand how these kingdoms survived for so long, you have to understand what the 14th and 15th centuries actually looked like. Not the clean narrative of empires rising and falling, but the actual chaos. The Mongols swept through the Middle East and Anatolia, destroying some things and leaving others. The Crusades overlapped with the Mongol invasions, creating an extraordinary period when small Christian kingdoms in the Eastern Mediterranean were simultaneously fighting Muslims, negotiating with Mongols, and trying to avoid being absorbed by Byzantium. Byzantium itself was so weakened by the Fourth Crusade that it could barely defend itself, let alone conquer anyone. The great powers were busy with each other. The small kingdoms found the gaps. The story begins in 1204, the year the Fourth Crusade made the biggest mistake in the history of Christianity. The Crusaders were supposed to go to Egypt and fight Muslims. Instead, they sacked Constantinople, the richest Christian city in the world, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the city that had defended Europe's eastern flank for 8 centuries. They looted it so thoroughly that Byzantine sources describe gold being stripped from the church domes, icons burned for their metal frames, horses stabled inside the Hagia Sophia. The Byzantine Empire shattered into fragments. And in the confusion, several successor states appeared simultaneously, each claiming to be the true Rome. The two main claimants to the Byzantine legacy were the Empire of Nicaea in northwestern Anatolia and the Despotate of Epirus in what is now northwestern Greece. Both called themselves legitimate successors to Constantinople. Both spent decades fighting each other as much as they fought the Latin Crusaders who now occupied Constantinople. It was the Empire of Nicaea that eventually won. In 1261, Emperor Michael VI Palaiologos retook Constantinople and restored the Byzantine Empire. But the restoration was hollow. Byzantium was now a shadow of itself, barely controlling the city and its immediate surroundings. In the same year that Constantinople was sacked, 1204, two brothers named Alexios and David Komnenos arrived on the northeastern coast of Anatolia with a small army and the backing of their aunt, the Queen of Georgia. Their family had been the ruling dynasty of Byzantium until a coup removed them. Now they were carving out a new state on the Pontic coast, the narrow strip of land between the Black Sea and the Pontic Alps. They called it the Empire of Trebizond, named after its capital city. And they gave themselves a title, Emperors of the Romans. Not former emperors, not pretenders, emperors. Trebizond had a geography that was almost purpose-built for survival. On one side, the Black Sea. Deep water, no beach to land an army, accessible only through a few defended ports. On the other side, the Pontic Alps, a mountain range so steep and so densely forested that medieval armies simply could not cross it in force. The empire occupied a coastal strip roughly 500 kilometers long and rarely more than 40 kilometers wide. It was strategically irrelevant in terms of agricultural land, but it sat at the western terminus of the Silk Road trade route from Persia and Central Asia. The merchants who came through Trebizond paid taxes that made the tiny empire wealthy far beyond its size. When the Mongols arrived in Anatolia in the 1240s, they did what Mongols did. They offered the local rulers a choice: submit, pay tribute, and continue to rule your territory under Mongol overlordship, or resist and be destroyed. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which controlled most of Anatolia, chose to resist. At the Battle of Kozai Dağ in 1243, the Mongols crushed the Seljuk army completely. After Kozai Dağ, the Seljuk Sultanate became a Mongol vassal state, still nominally existing but thoroughly subordinate. The power structure of Anatolia had changed completely. Trebizond's emperor, Mehmed I, saw what happened and immediately submitted to the Mongols. He sent tribute. He acknowledged Mongol supremacy. And in exchange, he kept his throne, his court, and his title. The Mongol overlordship actually benefited Trebizond in unexpected ways. The Mongol Pax, The period of relative stability that the Mongols imposed across their vast empire made the overland trade routes from China and Persia safer and more active than they had been in generations. Silk, spices, precious stones, and luxury goods flowed west through the Ilkhanate and arrived at Trebizond, where they were loaded onto Genoese and Venetian ships heading west. Trebizond became a commercial hub that rivaled much larger cities. Its emperors grew rich, built churches, patronized scholars, and staged elaborate court ceremonies that preserved Byzantine cultural forms while the actual Byzantine Empire was struggling to survive. The Komnenoi of Trebizond developed a distinctive survival strategy based not just on geography and trade, but on marriage. They married their daughters everywhere. A Komnenian princess went to the Mongol Ilkhan. Another went to a Turkoman chieftain. Another went to a Georgian nobleman. The emperors themselves married women from the Ilkhanate, from Georgia, from the nobility of Byzantium. Each marriage created a political connection, a reason for a potential enemy to think twice before attacking. The strategy was humiliating in some ways. The proud heirs of Rome marrying their daughters to Mongol khans. But it worked. No Mongol general attacked Trebizond. Why would he? His cousin or his father-in-law was sitting on the throne. Meanwhile, in the mountains of the Caucasus, the kingdom of Georgia had developed its own survival strategy. Georgia had been, in the 12th century, one of the most powerful Christian kingdoms in the Middle East. Queen Tamar, who ruled from 1184 to 1213, had presided over a golden age of Georgian culture, with poetry, architecture, and military expansion reaching heights that would not be matched again for centuries. Then the Mongols arrived. In the 1220s, the Mongol generals Jebe and Subutai raided the Caucasus. In the 1230s, the main Mongol army arrived and conquered the region systematically. Georgia was incorporated into the Mongol Empire, but Georgia's kings survived. They submitted. They acknowledged Mongol sovereignty. They paid tribute. They appeared at Mongol courts when summoned. And in exchange, they kept their thrones, their church, their laws, their language. The Mongols had no particular interest in replacing local administration as long as taxes were collected and soldiers could be recruited. Georgian kings found themselves serving as Mongol vassals, sometimes even leading Georgian troops in Mongol campaigns. But the kingdom persisted. When the Ilkhanate began to fragment in the early 14th century, Georgia was positioned to reassert independence. By the 1330s, as the Mongol successor states weakened and fought each other, Georgia was effectively self-governing again. The Armenian kingdom of Cilicia tells a different story, one of extraordinary diplomatic agility that ultimately ran out of options. Cilician Armenia was not the historic Armenian homeland in eastern Anatolia. It was a transplant. Armenian nobles and refugees who had fled west after the Seljuk Turks conquered Armenia in 1064 had established a new kingdom in the mountains of southeastern Anatolia along the Mediterranean coast. They called it Cilicia. By the 12th century, they had crowned their own kings, the Rubenid dynasty, and built one of the most interesting states in the medieval eastern Mediterranean. Cilicia had crusaders to the south in their coastal cities. It had Byzantium to the west. It had Muslim powers, first Seljuks, then Mongols, then Mamluks, to the east and south, and it navigated all of them with impressive skill. The Cilician Armenians allied with the Crusaders. Intermarriage with Crusader noble families was common, and Cilician troops fought alongside the Crusader kingdoms. Then the Mongols arrived, and the Armenians were among the first to submit and ally with them. King Hetum, I personally traveled to the Mongol capital at Karakorum in 1254 to negotiate, a journey of thousands of miles, and returned with guarantees of protection and permission to practice Christianity freely. For a generation, Cilicia and the Mongols were genuine allies. The alliance with the Mongols looked brilliant in 1260, when the Mongol army and Cilician Armenian troops together captured Damascus and temporarily drove the Mamluks out of Syria. But then came the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, the first major Mongol defeat inflicted by the Mamluks of Egypt. The Mongols retreated. The Crusaders, who had stayed neutral, lost their chance to ally with the Mongols against the Mamluks. And the Cilician Armenians found themselves on the wrong side of the new dominant power in the region, Egypt. The Mamluk sultans systematically raided and weakened Cilicia over the following century, while the Mongol ally the Armenians had counted on fragmented and converted to Islam, making them no longer natural protectors of a Christian kingdom. In 1375, the last Armenian king of Cilicia was captured by the Mamluks. The kingdom was finished. Back in the Aegean and Balkans, Byzantine successor states were also struggling to survive. After the Fourth Crusade, the Despotate of Epirus controlled northwestern Greece and had been a serious contender for the restoration of Constantinople, until the Empire of Nicaea beat them to it. When Michael YF retook Constantinople in 1261, the Despotate of Epirus was left as a regional power without a purpose. It survived for another 2 centuries, gradually shrinking through a combination of dynastic politics, occasional alliances with Serbia, and the simple fact that nobody powerful enough to conquer it ever quite got around to doing so. The most interesting of the late Byzantine survivor states was the Despotate of the Morea, the Byzantine state in the Peloponnese. After 1261, when Constantinople was restored, the Byzantine Empire steadily reconquered parts of Greece. By the mid-14th century, the Morea, the Peloponnese Peninsula, was under Byzantine control, governed by a despot appointed from the imperial family. It became the wealthiest and most cultured part of the late Byzantine world. Mistra, its capital, was a center of art, philosophy, and scholarship. When Constantinople fell in 1453, many Byzantine intellectuals fled to Mistra, or had already moved there. The Morea outlasted Constantinople by 7 years, falling to Mehmed II in 1460. And then there was Theodoro. Almost no one has heard of Theodoro. It was a tiny principality in the mountains of the Crimean Peninsula. The Crimea, the large peninsula extending south into the Black Sea. Theodoro was a Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christian kingdom in the mountains above the Crimean coast. It traced its origins to Byzantine colonization of the Black Sea coast, and it had survived somehow through the Mongol conquest of Crimea in the 1230s by occupying a mountain fastness that the nomadic Mongols found difficult to attack. It paid tribute, it kept its dynasty, and it persisted. Theodoro existed in an extraordinary neighborhood. On the coast below them were the Genoese, who controlled the major trading ports of Crimea, especially Kaffa, one of the most important commercial cities in the Black Sea. To the north were the Mongols of the Golden Horde, who controlled the steppes. In the 15th century, the balance of power shifted. The Golden Horde was fragmenting, the Ottoman Empire was rising, and the Genoese were increasingly isolated. Theodoro navigated all of it, allying with whoever could be useful, refusing to be absorbed by the Genoese, maintaining its Orthodox Christian identity. It even expanded in the mid-15th century, taking some Genoese-controlled ports. But 1475 ended everything in Crimea. The Ottomans sent a fleet and an army. The Genoese port of Kaffa fell in 3 days. The Genoese, who had been the commercial lords of the Black Sea for 2 centuries, were evicted. And Theodoro, which had survived Mongols, maintained its independence through the fall of Byzantium and the fall of Constantinople, was besieged and conquered. Its last prince, Alexander, was taken to Constantinople. The Byzantine world was now truly finished. From 1204 to 1475, 271 years of flickering survival. Then silence. So what made the difference? Why did Trebizond survive for 257 years when far larger and more powerful states fell within years? The answer is layered. First, geography. Trebizond's mountain barrier was real. Medieval armies could not simply march in. Any attacking force had to either brave the narrow coastal road, easily defended, or attempt a sea landing against a fortified harbor. No Mongol general considered it worth the effort. No Seljuk Sultan thought the prize justified the cost. The mountains were the most reliable ally Trebizond ever had. Second, economic indispensability. Trebizond was not just a small kingdom, it was a node in the most important long-distance trade network of the medieval world. Silk Road goods moved through the Ilkhanate, through Tabriz in Persia, and arrived at Trebizond for transshipment to the Mediterranean. Genoese and Venetian merchants maintained permanent colonies in Trebizond. The city collected substantial customs revenues. Destroying Trebizond would have disrupted a trade network that the Mongols themselves depended on. There was no economic logic to conquest. The empire was more valuable as a tributary trade hub than as a conquered province. Third, diplomatic skill. The Komnenian emperors of Trebizond were relentless diplomats. They sent embassies everywhere. They acknowledged the supremacy of whoever was most powerful at any given moment. The Mongols, then the Ilkhanate, then the rising Turkoman confederacies, eventually the Ottomans themselves, while maintaining their internal sovereignty and their court ritual. They paid tribute consistently, which meant no one had a strong grievance against them. They offered their daughters in marriage, which meant potential enemies became relatives. The combination of reliable tribute, useful trade, and strategic marriages kept Trebizond off every attacker's priority list for 2.5 centuries. The strategy had one vulnerability. It depended on being inconvenient to attack rather than impossible to attack. It worked as long as no one powerful enough to afford the inconvenience decided to make it a priority. In 1453, Mehmed II conquered Constantinople and became the most powerful ruler in the eastern Mediterranean. He now had a fleet capable of projecting power into the Black Sea. He had an army that had just taken the most fortified city in the world, and he had a clear strategic interest in ending the last states that could serve as rallying points for Christian resistance to Ottoman expansion. Trebizond was on his list. Mehmed waited 8 years. He consolidated his hold on Anatolia and the Balkans. He dealt with the despotate of the Morea in 1460. And then in 1461, he marched on Trebizond simultaneously by land and sea. Emperor David Komnenos had been trying to organize an anti-Ottoman coalition. He had written to the Pope, to the King of Georgia, to the Turkoman chieftain Uzun Hasan of the White Sheep. But the coalition never materialized. When the Ottoman fleet appeared in the harbor and the army appeared over the mountain passes, David Komnenos understood that resistance was futile. He surrendered. The city was taken without a battle. 257 years of the Empire of Trebizond ended in a negotiated surrender. David Komnenos was taken to Constantinople. Mehmed treated him reasonably at first. He was given a comfortable house and a pension. But in 1463, Mehmed received reports that David had been in contact with enemies of the Ottoman state. He had David Komnenos executed, along with his sons and a nephew. The Komnenian dynasty, the last dynasty that had called itself heirs of Rome, was finished. Their daughters, who had been married into various Muslim ruling families, survived. The last Komnenoi lived on as wives and mothers in foreign courts, their imperial titles meaningless, their dynasty extinguished. What does it mean that these kingdoms survived as long as they did? One answer is that the medieval world was messier and more contingent than the textbooks suggest. Empires did not simply expand until they covered everything. They had limits: geographic, logistical, political. A kingdom tucked behind mountain walls, paying reliable tribute, providing useful trade services, was not worth the cost of conquest as long as some other priority was more pressing. The small kingdom survived by being less important than the next problem. Another answer is that the Mongols, often portrayed as pure destroyers, were in fact highly pragmatic rulers. They destroyed what resisted them and preserved what submitted. The Mongols did not eliminate the Georgian king because the Georgian king was useful as a local administrator and tribute collector. They did not eliminate the Trebizond Empire because Trebizond was a commercially valuable tributary. The Mongols were building an empire for profit as much as for glory. States that made themselves profitable rather than threatening found that the Mongol Empire could be lived in, even if it couldn't be ignored. The story of the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia is the cautionary counterpoint. The Cilician Armenians made the right alliance with the Mongols at exactly the right time. For a generation, this gave them extraordinary power and security, but the alliance was built on a shared enemy and a shared strategic interest, and when those changed, when the Mongols converted to Islam, when the Mamluk power grew, when the Crusader cities fell, the alliance became worthless. Cilicia had no mountains to hide behind. It had no trade route that made it economically indispensable. Without its great power patron, it was simply a small Christian kingdom surrounded by hostile Muslim powers. The Mamluks destroyed it, the scholars and intellectuals who gathered in Mistra, the capital of the despotate of the Morea. In the final decades before 1453, knew they were watching the end of something. The philosopher Gemistos Plethon, who lived and worked in Mistra, was one of the most original thinkers of the late medieval world. He was a Neoplatonist who suggested, remarkably, that the Christian empire should return to the old Greek gods, or at least to a philosophical religion based on Plato and ancient Greek thought. His ideas shocked his contemporaries, but they also reflected a genuine sense that the Christian Byzantine tradition, as it had existed, was failing, and that something new needed to be imagined. Some of his students went to Florence, where their ideas fed into the Renaissance. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 sent a shock through the Christian world. But it also sent scholars, manuscripts, and ideas. Byzantine scholars who had been living in Constantinople or Mistra or Trebizond fled west. They brought with them Greek manuscripts, Plato, Aristotle, the ancient tragedians, that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries. They settled in Italy, where Italian humanists paid them to teach Greek and translate texts. The Byzantine collapse was, in an ironic sense, one of the causes of the Italian Renaissance. The empire ended. The culture moved. The Empire of Trebizond, in its final decades, had also been a place of Byzantine cultural survival. Its court maintained the elaborate ceremonial that Byzantine emperors had observed for centuries, the hierarchies of titles, the liturgical calendar, the architecture of palace ritual. Byzantine scholars visited. Artists worked. Churches were built. The Hagia Sophia of Trebizond, still standing today as a museum, was built in the 13th century and decorated with frescoes that represent some of the finest surviving examples of late Byzantine art. The empire was small. Its cultural output was not. After 1475, the Byzantine world was truly gone. But its afterimage persisted in unexpected places. The Greek-speaking communities of the Black Sea coast, descendants of the Trebizond Empire's population, survived under Ottoman rule for centuries. They maintained their dialect of Greek, their Orthodox Christian faith, their distinct culture. In the 20th century, after the Greek-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922, most were expelled in the population exchanges that followed. They settled in northern Greece, where their descendants still live, still maintaining traditions that trace back to the Empire of Trebizond. The empire is gone. The people it was made of are still there. The Genoese in Crimea, who had competed with Theodoro for control of the Black Sea trade, fared no better than the Greeks after 1475. The Ottoman conquest ended Genoese commercial dominance in the Black Sea permanently. The Black Sea became an Ottoman lake, closed to foreign shipping, for the next 3 centuries. The extraordinary commercial network that had made Trebizond wealthy was dismantled. The Silk Road terminal at Trebizond became a provincial Ottoman city. The Genoese colonies in Crimea became Ottoman possessions. The world that these small kingdoms had operated in, the fractured, multilateral, diplomatically complex world of the medieval Black Sea, was replaced by something simpler and more controlled. There is a particular poignancy to the Empire of Trebizond that is hard to articulate precisely. It was, in some sense, a state that existed on borrowed time from the moment it was founded. A refugee empire, built by exiles from a conquered capital, perched on a narrow coastal strip between the sea and the mountains, surviving through the extraordinary convergence of useful geography, valuable trade, and diplomatic agility. For 257 years, this worked. The odds against it were enormous. That it lasted as long as it did is one of the more remarkable facts in medieval history. The other small kingdoms have their own versions of this poignancy. Georgia's golden age under Queen Tamar was never recovered. The Georgian kingdom survived the Mongols, but the repeated invasions. By Mongols, then by Timur in the 1380s and 1390s, then by the Ottomans and Safavids in subsequent centuries, gradually weakened it until it fragmented into 3 separate kingdoms and eventually became part of the Russian Empire in the 19th century. The culture survived. The political independence did not. What all these kingdoms have in common: Trebizond, Georgia under Mongol rule, Cilician Armenia, Theodoro, the despotate of the Morea, is that they were all products of disaster. They came into existence because of the Fourth Crusade, the Mongol invasions, the Seljuk conquest of Armenia, the fragmenting of the Byzantine Empire. Catastrophe created the space they occupied, and the end of each kingdom was also produced by catastrophe. The Mamluk campaigns, the Ottoman expansion, Mehmed II's methodical elimination of every remaining Christian state in the eastern Mediterranean. The lesson these kingdoms teach is not simply about survival, though survival is remarkable enough. It is about the relationship between small states and great powers and how that relationship can be managed. The kingdoms that survived longest were the ones that understood what they were: small, vulnerable, useful in specific ways, and dependent on making themselves more trouble to destroy than to tolerate. This is not a heroic model of statecraft. It is a realistic one. And the kingdoms that rejected this model, that tried to fight the Mongols in open battle, that relied on great power alliances that collapsed, were erased. Mehmed II, when he finally went after Trebizond in 1461, is reported to have said something to the effect that the world could not have 2 swords. That is, 2 emperors. He used almost the same language that the original Byzantine emperors had used to justify their own empire's existence. The idea that universal order required a single universal ruler. The Empire of Trebizond had refused to accept this logic for 257 years. Its emperors called themselves emperors of the Romans in defiance of everyone. The restored Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, the Mongol Khans, the Ottoman sultans. In the end, Mehmed II's logic prevailed, but it took him 8 years after Constantinople to get around to proving it. The Hagia Sophia of Trebizond still stands on a hill above the modern Turkish city of Trabzon. Its frescoes have been damaged by time, by conversion to a mosque, by use as a military barracks. But enough survives to show what the painters were trying to do. Preserve, in image and color, the Byzantine world that was disappearing around them as they worked. They painted saints and angels and biblical scenes with the same care and the same iconographic tradition that Byzantine painters had been using for centuries. They did not know, or perhaps they did know, that within a generation or two, the empire that commissioned their work would be gone. They painted anyway. In 1475, when Theodoro fell and the last Greek principality in Crimea was extinguished, the Byzantine world was finally over. From 1204 to 1475, 271 years. The small kingdoms had outlived the Mongol conquest, the Black Death, the fall of Timur's empire, the rise of the Ottomans, and the fall of Constantinople itself. They had done it through geography, through tribute, through marriage, through trade, through the patient management of relationships with powers that could have destroyed them at any moment. They were not the inheritors of Rome in any meaningful military sense, but they kept the idea alive. The libraries, the churches, the court rituals, the frescoes. Long enough for some of it to make it out, and some of it did.